A coalition of workers and organizations throughout Massachusetts has begun a campaign for a higher minimum wage and more rights to sick time. To tell us about the agenda and why it's needed is a member of the Raise Up Massachusetts Coalition, the Deputy Director of MassUniting, Darrin Howell. Thank you very much for being with us, Darrin.
Thank you so much, Chris.
To start with, for people who are not working way down at minimum wage, what is it right now and how hard is it to get by on that?
Currently, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. Here in Massachusetts, it's $8 an hour. So we're a little bit above the current federal minimum wage, but unfortunately, it still does not put you at the above poverty line or at the poverty line for that matter.
So I think I saw one calculation is that even if you had 2 minimum wage jobs, you'd still be pretty far down there?
Yes, sir. So yeah, when we look at $7.25 an hour, and if an employee was actually having 40 hours a week of full-time employment, they would make about $16,000 a year. So if you had 2 employees making that wage, you're making $32,000, which is about $6,000 to $7,000 under the poverty line.
Because one of the things that we often hear from people who don't go along with raising the minimum is that, yes, there are real people working real jobs that pay this kind of money, but maybe they're just at one stage of their life. Maybe they're going to get more education, they'll move up and they'll do better. So we shouldn't be fixated on this particular job and this particular amount of money.
Yeah, I've heard that argument from a lot of the opposition as it relates to these 2 bills and areas that we're focused on. But the reality is that the average age of the individuals working is about 29 years old. So it's not youth trying to grow their resume or get involved initially in the workforce, but more or less it's people that find that the industries that's available for entry-level positions happen to be low-wage positions.
Well, I know there's a way we can look at this with numbers because if you look at what's paid now and you look at some of the earlier minimum wages going back in time, I guess we're not really keeping up if you look at the adjustments for inflation along the way.
Not at all. And that's part of the fight that we are embarking on right now, is saying that we're not keeping up with inflation. Minimum wage should be indexed so that we don't have to keep having this argument every single time.
Try to put some perspective in it, because when I was growing up, my first job, working at one of the neighborhood stores, was a job that paid a minimum wage, which I was very happy to be guaranteed. But in those days, adults, they had jobs with places where there were unions, and they were doing a lot better. So, it seemed that was the way the world was divided. But how do things shake out now? Because you talk about people in fast foods. I mean, when I was young, they were mostly kids.
Right. So right now, when we look at the various industries that are available for employment, a lot of the areas that offer a decent wage or a livable wage, they come with a certain amount of education, certain amount of work experience. But unfortunately, those opportunities haven't been available in quite some time to be at an entry level in that specific industry. So if you look at secretarial work, if you look at maybe some of the labor work that's out there, there used to be a clear avenue to grow within that industry. But right now that industry is looking for experience. So the person that has the educational experience or the work experience, they're now competing with one another in order to get that position.
Of course, the other threat that we also have from employers is that if you raise the bar on pay, they're not going to hire as many people. Of course, the most dramatic instance right now in Washington, D.C. is Walmart. So we're not going to open up these stores now if we have to pay more money.
Right. And what we have, research has shown that if people are making more, then they're spending more. So that these stores will be in a position to actually have more customers coming in, buying some of their products that's on the shelves. So the reality is that argument falls null and void amongst those that are aware that if I'm making more, then obviously I'm going to be spending more. And I'll be spending in, hopefully, not at Walmart per se, if they're not going to change some of their practices, but they will be spending them throughout the communities in the nation.
Talk about sick days, because this is another thing. When I was growing up, most of the grown-ups I knew, they had jobs with paid or earned sick days. That wasn't an issue, but why is this such a big issue now?
I mean, and I'm obviously not as old as you, Chris, but I definitely remember seeing households that had one family member that was at home. Maybe it was moms, and you had one parent that was out working, making obviously a livable wage to provide for the family. That's not the reality right now. With so many single-parent households, so many parents that have to take on one or more jobs, they're not around to be in the family's life and the children's life. So it's really becoming that dynamic of where does these youth go. So we talked before the show about, you know, the various public assistance programs that have been cut or, you know, been part of this economic reform that's in existence of let's cut these areas, let's cut these areas. But what is that ultimately creating? A lot of chaos and confusion in communities, especially urban communities of color.
What about the ability of parents to be there for their kids? Because, I mean, are you hearing stories where someone said, you know, my daughter was sick, but, you know, I tried to take the time and the boss put a lot of pressure on me? That's the kind of thing?
Yes. So unfortunately, with the lack of unions that's in those industries that would be affected by these legislation, there is no worker protection. So when an employee has to take off because a child is sick or they're sick, they're not, they haven't banked earned sick time. And I know there was language that spoke of paid sick time. And what we have pointed out is that individuals should be able to accumulate time over the course of working a certain amount of hours. And if they're able to do that, when life arises, they wouldn't be penalized or have to worry about some type of retribution for taking off and handling us.
Now, some businesses, especially smaller businesses, I imagine, will say, you know, this is really going to create problems for us. So what's the other side of the equation on that? Why should they buy into this?
Well, what we've been looking at is the amount of employees an employer has and how would they be affected by this legislation. So there will be a ratio to employer-employee that's mentioned in the legislation that's provided.
Now, this campaign is right now aimed at the state legislature, and I guess the idea is if this doesn't make any headway in the state legislature, then you're going to be looking at a referendum?
Yes, we're definitely going to end up taking it to the ballot. We feel that this is a necessity. We polled Massachusetts voters and seen how they felt about these two current bills that we're proposing, and it polled very high. So we know that the state is, as residents, is looking forward to seeing an increase in the minimum wage, and they are in support of earned sick time as well. So we feel this, that the legislators can't do it, then we will be taking it.
And what kind of an increase are we talking about with the wage?
We're talking about $11 an hour over the course of 3 years. So it's not a dramatic increase, but it definitely is an increase.
Thank you very much for being with us.
No problem, Chris. Thank you.
From MassUniting, Darrin Howell. We'll have more news in just a moment.